Welcome to Otherworld, stories of the strange and supernatural. Today, we offer Ghost Walk. Herb Wilson shivered as a gust of autumn wind tore across Nathan Phillips Square. "Whoa, this place is freezing," he complained. "I can't believe October in Toronto is so cold." He rubbed his hands together and blew on them for emphasis. His wife, Mavis, shot him an impatient glance. "Well, if you hadn't forgotten your gloves in the hotel, like you always forget everything, you wouldn't be so cold. Besides, it's only 2 degrees colder than Cleveland, so it wouldn't be any different if we'd stayed home." Herb looked up at the low gray clouds moving in from the west. He wrinkled his forehead pessimistically. "It's gonna rain any minute. I don't know why you had to pick a night like this for a walking tour." "The website said that most of the sightseeing takes place indoors," retorted Mavis. She gestured toward a signpost near the new city hall that read, "Ghost Walk Assembly Point." "Look, there it is." "And there's nobody there. Guess everybody else stayed away because it's such a lousy night." Mavis looked up at the clock tower of the old city hall building just beyond the square. "Oh, it's barely 10 after 7 now, and the tour's not till 7:30. That's probably why nobody else has arrived. I don't know why you always have to insist on being early for everything." Herb scowled. "Because you're always late for everything." As they reached the signpost, he shivered and rubbed his arms. "God, this place is freezing." "Stop complaining, Herb," replied Mavis. "You know what they say. Happy wife, happy life." "Yeah, I know what they say, but I'm still waiting for the happy life part." Mavis rolled her eyes. Herb sighed and resigned himself to a night of cold, damp tedium. Just then, a man appeared on the far side of the square. He looked to be about 30 years old, had a mustache, and wore a Victorian-style tweed suit and a bowler hat. He carried a silver-tipped walking stick in one hand, and in the other, a lit candle in a glass hurricane holder. The light from it reflected off the wet concrete, creating an eerie glow around him as he headed their way. "Oh, that must be the tour guide," said Mavis. Herb smirked. "Imagine having to dress up like that just to pay your bills. A hell of a way to make a buck, if you ask me." "Well, nobody asked you, so don't spoil this, okay?" The man now stepped up to them, smiled, and bowed slightly. "Good evening, folks. You here for the 7:30 tour?" "That's us," said Mavis. "We have reservations for Mavis and Herb Wilson." "Perfect. My name is Franklin, and I'll be your guide for this evening." "Franklin? That sure is an old-fashioned name," said Herb. "Well, my parents were old-fashioned people." If he was offended by Herb's comment, Franklin showed no sign of it. A cold drizzle began to fall. Franklin reached into his vest and withdrew an antique pocket watch. He checked the time, then gazed about the near-empty square. 7:13. It's turned out to be a rather slow night. If you'd like to begin now, we may proceed ahead of schedule." "You sure you don't want to wait till 7:30? asked Mavis. "Just in case anyone else shows up." Franklin shrugged. "Well, there are no other advanced bookings, and I would say that given the inclement weather, it's unlikely anyone else will be coming." "Then I vote for going right now," said Herb. "The sooner we get this over, the better. No offense, but I think this ghost stuff is all a bunch of hooey. It's my wife here who has a thing about spooks and spirits." "I see," smiled Franklin. "Well, I don't mean to sound boastful, but I like to think that this is the best ghost walk in the city. I guarantee that by the end of the night, I'll have you believing in spirits.
Oh, we'll see about that, said Herb.
Very well, replied Franklin. Then without further ado, let's begin. Please follow me. Holding his lantern out in front of him, Franklin led them north, away from the city square. Toronto is a young city, but it nonetheless has its share of ghosts. As you may have noticed if you flew into town, there are several small islands beyond the harbor. Actually, we didn't see them, said Mavis, because we drove here. My husband's too cheap to fly. 6 hours we drove from Cleveland just to save $200.
Well, the reason we drove, countered Herb, is that Mavis is always late. The last time we flew was to Orlando, and we missed our plane because Mavis wasn't finished packing in time. Cost me $300 extra to get us on the next flight.
Franklin smiled diplomatically and shifted the line of conversation away from marital acrimony. Even if you haven't seen the islands, oh, you're going to enjoy this story. It concerns the Gibraltar Point Lighthouse and the ghost of one J.P. Radden Mueller. One night in 18... Sorry to cut you off, interjected Mavis. But I know that story. The one where the redcoats murdered the lighthouse keeper because he sold them watered-down booze. Correct, replied Franklin. But I can tell you some fascinating details that I think you'll find... Mavis cut him off again. If it's all the same to you, I'd rather hear a different story. As you wish. Let me tell you about the ghost of Old City Hall. Mavis waved a hand to stop him. You mean the ghost of the guy who was sentenced to death, and now he tugs on the judge's ropes? Franklin sighed. Yeah, that would be him. Mavis frowned. Nah, been there, done that. Okay, then, said Franklin. I'm sure you'd be intrigued to know about the spirits that inhabit Mackenzie House. Well, that's the place where that mayor who tried to start a rebellion lived, isn't it? The most haunted house in the city. A ghost even slapped the housekeeper, I heard. I'm afraid that story's pure fiction, said Franklin. Ghosts might feel like slapping the living at times, but being non-corporeal, they lack the means to do so. Now, there is a particularly frightening apparition that appears at Old Mackenzie House. She's said to be so horrifying that... The woman with the long hair, Mavis interjected. Indeed, that is she. Oh, I know about her already. Couldn't help myself. Googled it while I was waiting for Herb to get off the toilet at the hotel today. Trust me, that gave me more than enough time to read up on it.
Too much information, Mavis. See what I have to put up with? She's never happy.
Oh, that's not true. I just want to hear a ghost story I don't already know. Is that too much to ask on a ghost walk that claims to be the best in town? Franklin betrayed no emotion. As a matter of fact, there is one ghost story that I can guarantee you've never heard before. But it's an extremely frightening one, with a terrifying conclusion. Not everyone has the emotional constitution to hear it. Mavis smiled, already triumphant. Young man, the ghost story hasn't been invented that can scare me. You are on. But let's raise the stakes. If I know the story, I want a refund. Franklin hesitated, rubbing one corner of his mustache as he considered her offer. An interesting proposition, madam. I shall accept your proposal. Now, if you would both please follow me, we shall begin. He led them down an alley. As you may have noticed,
The area around us is comprised of modern offices, restaurants, and shops. But in the 19th century, this was home to some of the country's earliest houses of industry. Today, only one of the original buildings still stands, at the end of the alley.
Franklin pointed toward an old 4-story brick walk-up. It was covered with graffiti, and all the windows were either boarded over or broken.
"Looks abandoned," said Herb.
Well, it is, but we have the owner's permission to be here. Franklin led them to the back of the building and with a courtly gesture, pointed toward a rusty fire door.
"After you."
"You're sure it's safe to go in?"
Well, I've never encountered any problems here. Even the homeless people and the street urchins stay away because of its ghostly reputation.
Herb smirked.
It's amazing how gullible some people are.
Herb pushed the door open, then entered. Mavis peered around him into the dark. Franklin followed them in, holding the lantern aloft.
Despite the peeling paint and crumbling plaster, this was once the elegant headquarters of the Miller Clothing Manufacturing Company. Its founder, Harold Miller, began as a humble tailor, then opened this factory, building it into the largest and most prosperous in the city. He became extremely wealthy and married the daughter of a prominent politician. They had 6 children, all of whom grew up to be part of high society. Besides being rich, Harold had an eye for the ladies. He became involved with one of his corset models, a young woman named Bridget Murphy. Now, in the Victorian era, this was a straight-laced city known as Toronto the Good. A child born out of wedlock would have scandalized the entire community. Harold would have been ostracized and his empire ruined. So, during the pregnancy, Harold had a number of secret rooms constructed in a sub-basement beneath the factory. He convinced the contractors that the soundproof chambers they were building were to house noisy machinery, and that, being the upstanding citizen that he was, he didn't want to disturb his neighbors with the incessant racket. After the sub-basement was completed, he furnished the secret rooms as living quarters. When in due course Bridget gave birth to a baby boy, they named him Phineas, and Harold ensconced mother and son in the soundproof, windowless suites beneath the factory. Harold supplied his son with all the physical necessities of life and personally educated him whenever he could slip down to the chambers without being observed.
Franklin turned to Mavis.
Any of this sounding familiar yet? No. I have to admit, I've never heard this story. Well, I can show you the chambers where he was raised. That is, if you're not too frightened by the prospect.
Frightened? Bring it on.
Then please follow me. Just watch your step. These stairs are very old.
Franklin led them down a creaky set of wooden stairs to a damp basement.
This it? Doesn't look like much. This is just the basement. Phineas lived in the sub-basement. To get there, you need to access a hidden entrance. If you would each press your hands up against the wall, right over there.
Mavis and Herb placed their hands on the spot that Franklin indicated. To their astonishment, a panel in the floor slid open, revealing a concrete staircase.
Well, I'll be.
Franklin led them down the secret passageway into a small anteroom. Then he held out his lamp, revealing a heavy steel door.
Would you do me a favor and open that, please?
Asked Franklin. Herb looked a bit miffed at the request. Franklin detected his annoyance and politely offered an explanation.
Well, it's just that between my candle and my walking stick, I don't have an extra hand.
Yeah, sure. No problem. Herb tugged on an industrial-style handle. There was a thunk as the latch mechanism disengaged.
Whoa, this is heavy,
he exclaimed.
Yes, it is,
replied Franklin.
It weighs nearly 800 pounds and was designed to be soundproof, just like the walls and ceiling.
Holding his lantern aloft, Franklin led Herb and Mavis into the chamber.
Sorry to trouble you, but would you mind closing the door?
Herb frowned a little, but he did as he was asked. He had to lean on the door with everything he had, just to budge it. The light was so dim that only after he shut the door did he notice something unusual.
Hey, there's no handle on this sign. How do you get out of here? I'll show you in a minute. Herb, never mind about the door. I want to hear the rest of the story.
Franklin held out his lamp, revealing a rotting Persian rug and a moldering sofa covered with cobwebs.
As you can imagine, this was hardly an idyllic environment for a young woman and her child. When Phineas was 13, his mother, driven mad by years of living in these tomb-like quarters, hanged herself. Phineas screamed and pounded on the walls to alert his father, but the soundproofing was so thorough that Harold never heard his son's cries for help. It was only when he came down on a routine visit with food and other supplies that he discovered his distraught son cowering before the corpse of his mother, which still hung from that rafter right over there.
Franklin pointed to a heavy wooden beam.
You can still see the rope marks if you look carefully. Phineas was never the same after that. His father visited him in the sub-basement as often as he could, but from that point on, the only living creatures Phineas encountered with any regularity were the rats that came up from the sewers. According to the legend, young Phineas gained their trust by feeding them scraps of leftover bread and cheese. They became his playmates. He scurried with them through the dark recesses of the basement, discovering uncharted sewers and passageways that connected the factory to the adjacent buildings, learning to move as soundlessly as the creatures of the night. When Phineas was 18 years old, his father finally released him from the cellar and gave him a generous monthly remittance on the condition that he would never reveal his true identity. But by then, the damage had been done. Phineas had what people nowadays might call emotional issues.
I'm not surprised, said Herb.
Just having a name like Phineas would be enough to turn you into a weirdo. Well, as a matter of fact, replied Franklin, Phineas disliked his given name too, and refused to answer to it. As for weirdo, well, that epithet hardly begins to describe him. By the time his ordeal was through, he'd become a psychopathic killer, so mentally disturbed that his only pleasure in life was to lure people down here and entomb them in these very chambers. Eventually, his old friends, the rats, would feed on the bodies. Those are the remains of two of his victims over there.
Franklin held the lantern out, revealing what appeared to be two human skeletons. Herb laughed.
Nice touch. But those look pretty fake. You'll need to get more convincing skeletons if you want anybody to buy that story. I shall consider it,
replied Franklin. Just then, from the darkened recesses of the sub-basement, they heard a rat squeak.
Perfect timing. Guess you got a secret button on your walking stick that triggers a soundtrack.
Franklin shook his head.
No, those are real rats in the furthest reaches of the chamber. They come up through the sewers. But don't worry, they're very shy creatures and would never dare to show themselves in the light. Of course, under the cover of darkness, that's a whole other story. If you say so,
said Herb, grinning skeptically.
So how many victims did this Phineas character have?
Asked Mavis.
No one knows for certain, replied Franklin, because, like Jack the Ripper, his identity was never established.
Mavis interjected.
Well, I hate to tell you, but there's two big problems with your tale. First of all, if this Phineas character's identity was never established, well, then you wouldn't know his name. Secondly, your story is about a serial killer, not a ghost. That's right, agreed Herb. You've said this was a ghost story, and if it's not, you promised us a refund. No, but this is a ghost story, replied Franklin. Because they say that Phineas's spirit still prowls the area around the old factory, looking for victims to lure down here, so he can entomb them.
Mavis looked deeply disappointed.
Well, that's an unpleasant story, I'll give you that. But I was expecting something a little spookier.
Franklin smiled indulgently.
Well, the story's not quite finished. Watch carefully. It was a pleasure to meet you both. But now, I must bid you adieu.
And with that, Franklin bowed slightly, then turned and strode straight through the solid rock wall with his candle, leaving Mavis and Herb Wilson in total darkness. Herb and Mavis noticed now that the air was unpleasantly close. Without the tour guide's single candle, the blackness in the tomb-like chamber was complete.
Herb, I'm getting claustrophobic being in the dark like this. Do you have your keychain with the pen light on it? Oh, damn, I left it at the hotel.
Herb turned and shouted toward the wall.
Hey, buddy, I don't know what kind of optical illusion that was, but you can get your butt back in here anytime and let us out.
When there was no reply, Herb took out his cell phone.
Fine. Have it your way. You won't think it's so funny when I call the cops on you, and then I'll call my lawyer. He'll sue your ass off.
The cell phone screen lit up, providing just enough light for Mavis to see the expression of concern on her husband's face.
What's wrong?
She asked.
I'm not getting any signal. Check your phone. Maybe yours gets better reception.
Mavis pulled out her cell, but found that deep in the sub-basement, behind the thick stone walls, under tons of concrete, she too was receiving a no-service message. Then they heard a squeak. And another. They were closer this time, in the dark.
Son of a bitch!
What are we gonna do? Asked Mavis, panic creeping into her voice.
I told you this was a bad idea.
But Franklin heard none of their threats or complaints, because by then he had rematerialized in Nathan Phillips Square. The light drizzle had transformed into a cold rain, and the wind had picked up. He smiled to himself as he watched the people in the queue for the 7:30 Ghost Walk. There were 8 of them, plus the tour guide. Franklin checked his pocket watch. It was 7:33. The people in the queue were becoming impatient. Franklin suppressed a knowing chuckle as he watched the befuddled tour guide do a head count. 5, 6, 7, 8, said the guide. Oh, there's supposed to be 10. Who's not here? The guide then checked his reservation list. Oh, looks like we're missing the Wilsons. Okay, folks. I realize nobody likes standing around in the rain. We'll give them 2 more minutes. If they haven't arrived by then, we'll head on without them. The people assembled for the tour were now shivering in the rain, hunching their shoulders and huddling together for warmth. Of course, being a ghost, Phineas Franklin Miller felt neither the cold, wind, nor the rain as he strode past them into the night. And being a psychopath, neither did he feel the least bit of sympathy for Herb and Mavis Wilson. Just a smug sense of triumph and satisfaction in the knowledge that his old friends, the rats, would be well fed for the winter. We hope you have enjoyed Ghost Walk. Watch for more Otherworld stories. Until then. Otherworld is written and created by Edward Kay. Voices, music, and soundscape by Anthony Vanderberg.